Cairo, July 27, 1980. Dawn breaks over the Nile, pale light filtering through half-drawn blinds in a private suite at Mayadi Military Hospital. The room carries the sterile chill of a place where science has run out of answers. Monitors beep irregularly now. Slower, as if tiring of the effort. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, once Shahan Shah of Iran, King of Kings, light of the Aryans, lies motionless beneath crisp white sheets. His body, diminished to a shadow of what it once was, tells the story that his court never permitted to be spoken aloud, years of concealed illness carried in silence beneath the weight of a crown. A spleen the size of a small melon had been removed just days before. It hadn't been enough. Farah Pahlavi sits beside him. She holds his hand, the same hand that placed a crown upon her head 21 years earlier in Golestan Palace, before the cameras of the world, before the cheering thousands who believed the dynasty was forever. Outside, Egyptian guards stand silent in the corridor. Anwar Sadat has given his orders. No interruptions. The man who ruled from the peacock throne, who hosted emperors and kings in silk tents at Persepolis, who commanded one of the most formidable military machines in the Middle East, that man draws his final breath here. Alone, in exile, far from Tehran, far from everything that was built to make him eternal. There is no ceremony, no state farewell, no court in attendance, just the hum of machines, a grieving wife, and the quiet indifference of a foreign city going about its mourning. If that image stays with you, that distance between unimaginable wealth and utter isolation, consider leaving a like. Subscribe for more of these stories, dark luxury old money tragedies, the real cost behind the crowns. Turn on notifications. The next one drops soon. Reza Shah Pahlavi, the father, did not inherit power. He took it. A Cossack brigade officer, he dismantled the Qajar dynasty in 1925 through a bloodless coup backed quietly by British interests, wary of unstable rule. He crowned himself Shah, drew inspiration from Ataturk's secular reforms, and drove Iran into the modern era with the grip of a man who had no patience for the past. Roads, railways, universities, forced into existence by sheer will. He banned the veil. He mandated Western dress. He built a national identity from the top down, whether the nation wanted it or not. His son Mohammad Reza inherited the throne in 1941 under far less auspicious circumstances. Allied forces had deposed the old man for flirting with Germany during the war. What the younger Shah received was a nation still feudal in places, uncertain, restless, its oil wealth barely tapped. He was 21 years old. Photographs from that period show a young man who looks precisely as uncertain as he was. The 1950s brought the first real test. British Petroleum and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company controlled Iran's black gold. Prime Minister Mossadegh nationalized it in 1951, triggering a crisis that shook the region. What followed in 1953, Operation Ajax, was a CIA-orchestrated reversal that restored the Shah to full authority, now firmly anchored to American backing. It was a lesson the Shah absorbed deeply power, even in the ancient seat of Persia, was partially rented from elsewhere. Oil revenues, especially after the 1973 embargo, transformed Iran into a petrostate that the West could not afford to ignore. Money arrived in volumes that strained the infrastructure built to manage it. The Shah dreamed accordingly. His White Revolution of 1963 pushed land reform, women's suffrage, a literacy course, 6 sweeping reforms delivered by royal decree rather than democratic process. In 1959, he married Farah Pahlavi, educated, architectural in her thinking, elegant in her bearing. Their wedding was watched across the globe. Together they projected something Iran had never quite managed before the image of a civilization catching up with its own ambition. Tehran transformed beneath their watch. Boulevards widened. High-rises broke the skyline. Imported Mercedes and Cadillacs moved through streets lined with French boutiques. The Shah's personal fleet included a custom Rolls-Royce Phantom, IV, one of only 18 ever produced armored midnight blue chrome, catching the desert light. His Boeing 707 traveled with interiors paneled in gold leaf cream leather seating and a bar stocked with vintages most heads of state would envy. These were not affectations. They were statements, carefully composed messages to the world that Iran had left the developing world behind and arrived somewhere else entirely. Nayavaran Palace sprawled across the northern hills of Tehran, Carrara marble, underfoot baccarat crystal, overhead gardens, irrigated to suggest Versailles despite the surrounding aridity. The Shah maintained multiple residences Sadabad in the cooler northern elevations marble palace for formal state occasions, each maintained to the exacting standards of European royalty, staffed by hundreds stocked with the finest European imports. Beneath the central bank, a vault held the crown jewels, centuries of accumulated splendor from the Safavid and Qajar dynasties. The peacock throne itself, commissioned in the early 19th century, was encrusted with over 26 zero-stones rubies, emeralds, pearls the size of small fruit, framing a radiant sun disk. The Darya-i-Nur, a 182-carat pale pink diamond, one of the largest on Earth, rested nearby in a setting of 457 smaller diamonds and 4 rubies. Conservative estimates placed the collection's total value between $20 and $50 billion in today's terms. It was not merely decoration. It was the financial bedrock of the Iranian rial itself. Farah, meanwhile, pursued a quieter ambition. Tehran's Museum of Contemporary Art acquired Picasso's Warhol's Pollux, $2.5 billion in canvases that the public rarely saw held in storage like state secrets, waiting for a cultural moment that never quite arrived. Then came October 1971, and Persepolis. To mark 500 years of Persian monarchy, Maison Janson of Paris designed a tent city on 160 acres of cleared desert, 50 prefabricated luxury structures, arranged in a star formation, air-conditioned, connected by direct telex lines to world capitals. Walls lined with 37 kilometers of silk, baccarat crystal, Limoges china, Port-Sault linens. Maxims of Paris shuttered for 2 weeks to cater the event. 18 tons of food arrived by airquail's eggs filled with imperial Caspian caviar crayfish, mousse in Nantua sauce, slow-roasted lamb with truffles. 50 peacocks presented whole, their plumage restored for display after the kitchen had finished with them, glazed figs, raspberry champagne sherbet. Dom P. Rignan Rose 1959 was poured for 600 guests across a banquet that lasted 5.5 hours. Haile Selassie attended. 9 kings, 5 queens, presidents, and sheiks. The official cost, $17 million at the time, translates into hundreds of millions today. It was spectacle designed to tell the world Iran had arrived, that Persia was not a memory, but a living force. The ancient ruins of Darius's palace lit in golden light behind the guests as they dined. The symbolism was total, the intention unmistakable. What the Shah couldn't say, was what it cost to keep that image intact. Behind the boulevards and the Baccarat SAV, aka the secret police, moved quietly. Dissidents were detained. Opposition was not merely discouraged, it disappeared into facilities whose methods the regime never advertised. The Gilded Age had a shadow it preferred not to discuss. And for a while that silence held. The cracks appeared slowly at first, then all at once. By the mid-1970s, The oil windfall had created something unexpected, not stability, but pressure. Inflation climbed. Rural migrants flooded into Tehran's expanding slums, while wealth pooled in narrower and narrower circles. The construction boom created a city that looked modern from above and felt deeply unequal from within. The White Revolution, intended as liberation, had alienated the clergy. Land seized from mosque endowments. Women unveiled by state decree. AK's dossiers, thickened students, bazaar merchants, intellectuals, all quietly seething beneath a surface that official photography always showed as calm. The Shah called them communists or reactionaries. He had an answer for every grievance that didn't require him to listen. Persepolis, that monument to a rival, had become something else entirely in the national memory. While the tents rose in the desert and elaborately dressed peacocks gleamed under chandeliers, ordinary Iranians were queuing for bread. The contrast did not require interpretation. It required only eyes. Farah understood this more than she let on. Her private notes from the period reflect a woman aware of AK's excesses, quietly advocating for restraint. But the Shah held final authority, and as the 1970s deepened, that authority was being exercised by a man growing increasingly isolated, surrounded by courtiers who competed to confirm his every instinct, trusting fewer people with each passing month. There was another secret known to almost no one. In the early 1970s, physicians in France had identified chronic lymphocytic leukemia. The diagnosis was concealed even from most of his inner circle. Treatment continued discreetly. His body was weakening at the same pace his grip on the country was loosening. Neither fact was permitted to become public knowledge. External pressures assembled without mercy. Jimmy Carter's human rights agenda made the Shah feel abandoned by his oldest ally, a man who had built his security architecture around American approval, now found that approval conditional in ways it had never been before. The Soviet Union provided quiet encouragement to opposition groups. Across the border, Iraq watched and waited. And from a modest apartment in Paris, Ayatollah Khomeini's cassette recordings were being smuggled into Iran by the thousands played in mosques across the country, filling prayer halls, with a vision of governance that had nothing to do with peacock thrones or baccarat chandeliers. By 1978, the demonstrations could no longer be quietly dispersed. Black Friday, September 8, saw troops open fire in Jala Square. The precise number of those who lost their lives remains disputed. What is not disputed is what it meant for the relationship between the Shah and the people he claimed to lead. That relationship, whatever it had been, did not survive the afternoon. The Shah vacillated. Concessions, when they came, arrived too late. Repression, when applied, fed the very fury it sought to extinguish. He was by this point a man caught between the instincts of autocracy and the pressures of a world that no longer tolerated them cleanly. The family felt the shadow close in. Crown Prince Reza, 18, trained with the U.S. Air Force, watched his father age years in months. The Shah's daughters grew up in palaces. Exile was something they had heard whispered in adult conversations, but never truly believed possible. Farah wrote later that she saw tears in the Shah's eyes on the day they left Tehran. The runway was nearly empty. The aircraft waited. Whether they would ever return, that question went unspoken, because neither of them could bear to give it a real answer. January 16, 1979. The Shah, Farah, and a small entourage boarded a Boeing 707 at Tehran's airport. Outside, crowds gathered, some weeping, some celebrating the city itself, uncertain of what it felt. Inside the aircraft, silence. He carried a small box of Iranian soil. The plane lifted off. The Shah turned to look at the lights of Tehran receding below. It was framed publicly as a vacation. No one believed it. Not even him. What followed was a slow unraveling across continents. Egypt first Sadat received him with the warmth of a genuine friend, rare currency in those months. Then Morocco, Hassan I hosting briefly before diplomatic pressure became too much. The Bahamas, Mexico. Through all of it, the illness advanced the spleen, enlarging with quiet relentlessness. The body that had once stood straight in military uniform now visibly diminished. By October 1979, the condition had reached a point that could no longer be managed discreetly. Carter authorized treatment in New York, a splenectomy at Memorial Sloan Kettering. The organ removed weighed 8 kilograms. 4 days later, Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran. 444 days of captivity for those held inside. The Shah's presence on American soil had provided the pretext. The Fury had been waiting for any available door. January 1980, Panama. Torrijos offered asylum. But the threat of extradition began to feel very real. By June, the Shah had returned to Cairo at Sadat's invitation. Post-operative complications set in pneumonia, then infection, the kind that finds those whose defenses have been quietly eroding for years. The body, which had carried so many secrets for so long, had simply exhausted its capacity for concealment. July 27, 1980. 9:45 in the morning. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was 60 years old. Farah was beside him. No other family present. The funeral was held at Al-Rifai Mosque, modest, without ceremony, becoming a man who had staged the most elaborate banquet of the 20th century. Sadat entered personally, the only head of state to do so. It was in its quietness, the most honest thing the Shah had experienced in decades of farewell without performance. The family scattered into their separate griefs. Reza Pahlavi, 20 years old on October 31, 1980, declared himself Shah in exile, a title without territory, a gesture of continuity against erasure. He settled in the United States, married Yasmin, built a life around the idea that history might yet turn. Ali Reza, the youngest son, could not find the same footing. He carried a darkness that neither privilege nor exile could resolve. A man who grew up defined entirely by an inheritance that no longer existed, in a country he could not return to, under a name that the world associated with a fallen order. In 2011 in Boston, he chose to leave. He was 44. Leila, the youngest daughter, had spent years in quiet struggle with her sense of self, with an identity constructed entirely around a dynasty that vanished before she was old enough to understand what she was part of. On June 10, 2001, she was found in her room at the Leonard Hotel in London, having lost her final battle. She was 31. Farah identified the body herself. Some speak of a peacock throne cursed the Safavid dynasty that commissioned its legacy collapsed under Afghan siege in 1722. The Qajars who inherited it fell in 1925. The Pahlavis lasted 54 years. The throne endures. Its owners do not. Today, Reza Pahlavi lives quietly in the United States, Virginia, reportedly continuing to advocate for secular democracy and what he calls a transitional framework for Iran after the Islamic Republic. He speaks at diaspora events. He lobbies Washington. He writes forewords to economic recovery blueprints designed for a country that may one day need them. There is no throne to reclaim. There is only the argument that the idea of Iran is worth preserving and that someone must keep making it. Farah remains in Paris. She gives interviews with the careful composure of a woman who has survived things that would have broken most. She maintains a quiet archive of memory memoirs, photographs, the deliberate preservation of a version of history that official Tehran has spent decades trying to bury beneath its own narrative. The crown jewels remain locked in their vault beneath the central bank of Iran, untouched, undiminished, belonging now to a republic that has no use for them except as proof that it won. The peacock throne sits in its museum behind glass, visited by schoolchildren who are taught a very different story of what it represents. The Rolls-Royce Phantom IV gathers dust in a garage at Nevarin Palace, which is now open to tourists for the price of an entry ticket. The Boeing 707 was scrapped long ago. The silk tents of Persepolis exist only in photographs taken by guests who never imagined they were documenting a final act. What lingers is a question that wealth in all its forms was never equipped to answer. A man built an empire on oil ambition and the belief that Western alliances were permanent and that modern aesthetics could substitute for genuine consent. He saw it dissolve not through invasion, not through superior military force, but from within, carried by millions of ordinary people who decided in the end that the spectacle was no longer worth the cost of admission. The jewels were real. The jets were real. The banquets were extraordinary in their excess. None of it purchased loyalty when the streets filled with a different kind of certainty. Power in the end isolated him completely. The court that surrounded him reflected only what he wished to see. The illness he concealed became a metaphor for everything his reign refused to acknowledge. And the family he built that dynasty to protect paid the full price, scattered across continents haunted by losses that no exile community could properly absorb, diminished in ways that no biography fully captures. The throne that once glittered beneath 1,000 lights now stands as an empty pedestal in a city that has officially erased his name. Did the peacock throne ever truly belong to anyone, or does it simply wait patient, indifferent, eternal for the next one who believes they are the exception?